all of these different formats. And this is a little bit of a way of understanding how I'm thinking about this. So when I'm acting as a crafts person, I think that I'm bound by these limits of order, history, and tradition. When I step over the line and I find myself in the designer mode, I'm looking at and confined by unsought subjectivity, functionality, and individuality. When I slip over into that section, that extreme, that edge of artist, I'm bound by much less, I think, spontaneity, creativity, transcending one's limitations, which is the hardest thing, and that search for one's truth. Now, there are many truths. Surrender to one's highest excitement. This is the gateway, and this is what the center of my talk is about. That is to identify and to follow one's highest excitement in the making process, okay? And it has to do with inspiration. One of the paradigms that we have been functioning under in art since the Second World War is modernism, okay? And I am more akin to following this philosophy and paradigm called wabi-sabi, which is an Eastern Japanese philosophy of life, art, and such. And if you look at these two and you compare them, it's really an interesting thing. Modernism implies a logical, rational worldview. Wabi-sabi implies an intuitive worldview. Intuitive meaning inside, right? Intuitive. Modernism looks outside for this rational view. Modernism looks for universal prototypical archetypal solutions. Wabi-sabi looks for personal idiosyncratic solutions. We're all individuals, right? So this is what is nurturing my sense of my individuality. Expresses faith in progress, and Wabi-sabi suggests that there is no progress, but it is circular. Modernism is future-oriented. Wabi-sabi is present-oriented. Modernism solicits reduction of sensory information. The opposite is true in Wabi-sabi. Modernism is intolerant of ambiguity. Wabi-sabi is very comfortable with ambiguity. Are you comfortable with ambiguity? Raise your hand if you are. Are you comfortable with ambiguity? Okay.
Some areas.
The archetypal form for modernism is a cube. Now think about what that means. What is the meaning of a cube? What does it say? Okay, and the archetypal form for a bowl, for wabi-sabi, is an open bowl. And finally on my list is what modernism seeks: slick, shiny surfaces, devoid of the hand. Wabi-sabi makes use of raw, natural surfaces of each material, sort of stripping away disguises of it. Also clay, so architecture is one of these formats that I hang my hat on. And this image here is very interesting because it's architecture embedded into the landscape. It's down on the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the house of the governors at Uxmal. But clay is a process, okay? It is a process that most closely mimics the thinking process. It's plastic, holistic, spontaneous, and it's demanding. Those of us who work with clay know this all too well. It's like when you pull a hunk of clay out of the barrel or out of the mixer, it has no shape, no form. You've got to bring everything to it. But if you're a sculptor working with steel, I-beams, 2x4s, you get it in those forms. This material, wood, steel, has been processed. There's an enormous historical precedent that brings this shape to your studio. It's going to be in your work no matter what. Okay, you can't get around it. So I think that the clay, and this is why I gravitate to it, brings more out from me. The ceramic artist sees craft as confinement of their individuality. We can think of the individual as the conscious modification of life or energy within the limits imposed by the natural laws. This question of restricting the individual is a question really of the generality where the particular me, you, takes place. Each one of us has their very own set of laws. You have your own philosophy that you live by, don't you? We all do. There's no one truth. There are 7,625,000 truths, right? One for each person on the planet. So we overlay our own philosophies and truths onto this general law, okay? And this is what the psychologists call cognitive commitments or biases. And it seems as though we, each of us, are born with some of these and we're taught others. Let me back up just a second. Because we ceramic artists use fire as a medium, as a process, thermodynamics tends to be, seems like a nice, an appropriate idea to sort of talk about this. And so I'm going to talk about the second law of thermodynamics, which states a general law which describes the transformation of energy into work. And energy has a dimension, both within physics and within the human being. Psychologists call this psychological energy in the human being. It is the impetus that gives rise to activity or creative endeavor, creative energy. Aristotle talked about this. He described energy as what can become. Once again, imagination. I'm never so excited as when the clay comes into the studio on the palette and I look at it and I go, wow, all of the possibilities that could be are in that. And like when I'm looking at a building under construction, it's never so beautiful as when it's in that construction process. Once it's done and the doors are hung, it's finite. It's been limited. The energy is finite. It's only going to be what you see. So there's a little bit of a disappointment in that. This law also states that a certain proportion of energy cannot be transformed into the work, but remains as energy without order or disorder, or I like to call it freedom, and that contains an expanded, or it wants to continue to expand and increase this little bit that isn't transformed into the work. All of this refers to a closed system. Craft has been a closed system within the general culture since the beginning, or maybe since medieval guilds anyway. It's concerned with tradition, as I pointed out in that opening diagram. Tradition oriented towards technology and is irreversible since time moves in only one direction. So disorder is directed towards the future, this creative impulse. Disorder can be thought of as the absence of order. The greater the disorder, the greater the freedom. For crafts, this is obvious. The ceramicist has an urge to move towards disorder. This is a necessary urge and response towards an increasing disorder and for that freedom. It's, I think of it kind of like the ring in the Lord of the Rings. Its master is constantly calling. So there's this impulse, this energy to expand. And this is all comes from my experience since I was 11 until now. And in that working process, this is what I have found to be true. If we compare the craftsperson's order with the artist's freedom, it becomes evident. Determination through tradition is, in fact, a compulsion, a belief in tradition that becomes tradition, and a belief in that. Sorry, I wrote this down and I'm trying to read it. A belief in tradition and that it becomes creativity, but it is not. It is at best innovation, that is the rearrangement of known aspects and components of a given composition. From creativity, if you remember the first slide I showed, David Bohm, a famous physicist, he wrote a book called On Creativity. And he states that true creativity out of true creativity must come a new emergent property. And I interpret that to be something that is not seen. I've been teaching graduate students for something like 35, 40 years. And I encourage them, if they want to make pottery, yeah, make pottery. But you must make a pot that I've never seen. Okay? Is it possible? Is it possible in the year 2018 to make a pot, which is, how old is pottery? How many different forms are there? Is it possible to make a new form, something that's never been seen before?
It could be, yeah.
You
Yeah,
think so?
I think so, yeah.
Good. Yeah. So, let's see. So if this is to happen, function has to take a back seat to unsought subjective for functionality. Technical skill ranks below spontaneity and creativity. One's way of life is no longer determined by what one has learned through experiences, but by transcending one's own limitations. Also, let me say that all of the images in this slide lecture are my work, except when designated, like in this particular image of Tom Friedman's functional chair moving towards disorder. But I think I've labeled them all. So other than that, that's all my work. The craftsman becomes an artist when he has found his style. This is one of my ideas of functionality. Not very functional, I don't think. The craftsman becomes an artist when he has found his style, only after proving his versatility, tested his potential, and expressed his freedom in the choice of the circumstances of his creativity and the meaning of his own work. So there's a tension between craft and fine art. I feel it. Do you feel it when you're making it? And it's caused by not recognizing the chaos or that bit of energy that is ever expanding. In order to achieve a breakthrough, right? Just like that ring, it's wanting to break through to its master. Various stages of disorder will always be present during the making process. You will see, as you work, you'll see the good next to the ugly. Oh, I like that mark. No, I don't like that. Oh, that's unpleasant. Next to the beautiful. The artist may see his own art as a disruptive factor. That is, making a judgment. Try to postpone that judgment. Is this to be good or bad? Is it something we do subjectively, guided by those learned biases, conditioned responses to life? It's interesting that I was in the Chicago Art Institute and I saw this piece in one of the cases, and it's sort of an example of this. Why? I mean, this is like a sagger fire. We know what this is. This is a sagger. Somehow it's got this, it's failed in some way because it's got this hunk of chunk in the middle of this beautiful chung blue glaze. But they decided to exhibit it as part of the display. So there's something here. There's something that they're responding to. And I contend that it is this chaos, this urge or balance for freedom. Okay. So when we do this, we will remain in a realm of innovation. That is, if we remain bound by these parameters, if we don't allow ourselves to follow our highest excitement in the making process, we will be bound in the realm of innovation rather than giving rise to what David Bohm calls a new emergent property, and I call art. The gateway to this is true creativity is to follow your highest excitement in each moment as you become the observer to the creative chaos that is happening before you. The next step is the hardest, and that is to act on what has sparked your excitement. You've noticed it now. Now what are you going to do about it? This is another indicator that you've entered the altered state of consciousness we call art, that you've noticed it. Now when we return to this normal state of mind, we then can judge what we're looking at. We can judge the artifact as good or bad based on linear thinking, known biases, and cultural biases. Okay. Accept it or not. Wabi-sabi asks us to suspend the judgment, to slow way down, to look and to see. See, S-E-E. What does that mean? Robert Irwin wrote an entire book on this subject called Seeing is Forgetting the Thing You're Looking At. Have you read that book? It's an interesting notion on transcendence. Wabi-sabi says all things, so long as they don't cross the line into the grotesque, have the potential of bubbling up in our minds and in our mind's eye as beautiful.